Scapegoating. Scapegoating converts the complex question of why a society is suffering into a simple answer with a human face attached to it. Economic collapse, military defeat, social dislocation all produce real anger that needs somewhere to go. The propagandist's job is to redirect that anger away from structural causes and toward a designated group. The group does not need to be actually responsible. It needs to be identifiable, sufficiently different from the majority, and unable to effectively defend itself. Rwanda in 1994 demonstrated the terminal end point. Radio broadcasts calling Tutsi people cockroaches contributed directly to 800,000 deaths in 100 days. The anger was real. The target was constructed. The hero cult. Every authoritarian government has understood that people do not follow systems. They follow people. The hero cult is the deliberate construction of a leader as a figure of supernatural capability and moral perfection, whose authority derives not from law, but from an almost divine personal quality. North Korea has taken this furthest. 3 generations of the Kim family have been presented to their population as godlike figures controlling weather, performing miracles, and existing on a plane entirely separate from ordinary human beings. Stalin's portraits hung in every Soviet home. Mao's image was worn as a badge over the heart. The hero cult works because it converts political loyalty into something that feels like personal devotion, and personal devotion is significantly harder to revoke than political agreement. Manufactured consent. This propaganda method operates inside democracies, requiring no government directive and no obvious coercion. It works through media ownership, advertising economics, and the social dynamics of professional journalism. A media ecosystem dependent on advertising revenue will not aggressively cover the industries funding it. Journalists who challenge official sources find their access restricted. Nobody issues instructions. The system self-regulates through incentives. The result's a population believing it has a free press while consuming information filtered through invisible layers of institutional interest. The most effective censorship never needs to announce itself. Fear-mongering. Fear is the propagandist's most reliable tool because it bypasses rational evaluation almost entirely. A population that is frightened enough will accept restrictions on its freedom, tolerate the targeting of minority groups, and support military actions it would otherwise question, all in exchange for the promise of safety. The technique requires a threat that is real enough to be credible, but vague enough to be impossible to definitively disprove. The War on Terror provided a generation-defining example, a threat that was genuinely real in some dimensions, but was amplified, sustained, and deployed politically in ways that justified surveillance programs, military interventions, and civil liberties restrictions that had nothing to do with the original threat. Fear-mongering works best when the solution to the fear always requires more power concentrated in the hands of those promoting it. The big lie. The most effective propaganda technique ever documented is not subtle, it is overwhelming. People find it easier to believe an enormous lie than a small one because they cannot conceive that anyone would fabricate something so vast without some basis in truth. Small lies are recognizable. A lie of sufficient scale and repetition bypasses that recognition entirely. Nazi Germany used it to convince an educated industrial population that Jewish people caused the country's economic collapse, repeated through every available channel until questioning it felt socially dangerous. The big lie did not die with the Third Reich. Every authoritarian government since has deployed variations of it, and the digital media environment has made it more potent than ever. Repetition. Repetition is not a supplementary propaganda technique. It is the mechanism through which all other techniques become effective. A claim heard once is evaluated. A claim heard 1,000 times becomes part of the assumed background of reality. The advertising industry understood this before governments did, and political propaganda borrowed the insight directly. Soviet propaganda repeated the same ideological frameworks across every available medium for decades until the frameworks became invisible, not believed so much as simply assumed. Modern political messaging operates on the same principle, deploying key phrases across television, social media, rallies, and print simultaneously until the phrases stop being evaluated and start being felt. Repetition does not make something true, it makes something familiar, and familiarity is consistently mistaken for truth. Censorship and information control. Controlling what a population can access is the foundational infrastructure on which all other propaganda techniques depend. If the big lie can be immediately contradicted by an independent press, it fails. If the hero cult can be punctured by documented evidence of the leader's failures, it collapses. Information control removes those checks. China's Great Firewall blocks access to foreign news sources, social media platforms, and search results that contradict official narratives, not through obvious censorship announcements, but through technical friction that makes accessing accurate information inconvenient enough that most people do not bother. North Korea goes further, making unauthorized information access a criminal offense. The sophistication of modern information control lies in its invisibility. Populations living inside it frequently do not experience it as censorship, but simply as the normal limits of what is knowable. Whataboutism. Whataboutism is the propaganda technique that makes accountability impossible by ensuring every accusation is met with a counter-accusation rather than a defense. When confronted with evidence of human rights abuses, the Soviet Union's standard response was to point to racial segregation in the United States. When confronted with election interference, modern Russia points to American foreign policy interventions. The technique does not deny the original accusation. It deflects it, creating a false moral equivalence that allows the audience to conclude that since everyone does bad things, no specific bad thing requires a specific response. Whataboutism is particularly effective in a media environment where audiences are already primed to distrust their own governments because it exploits that existing distrust to neutralize criticism of genuinely worse behavior elsewhere. Euphemism and language control. Controlling the language used to describe events is controlling how those events are understood. Governments have always understood this. Civilian deaths in military operations become collateral damage. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. Ethnic cleansing becomes population transfer. Propaganda does not always operate through dramatic claims. Sometimes it operates through the quiet replacement of accurate language with language that removes moral weight from what is being described. George Orwell identified this mechanism in 1946 and called it the defense of the indefensible, the use of abstract passive language to make actions that would be immediately condemned if described directly disappear into bureaucratic neutrality. The technique is so embedded in political and military communication that most people who use it are no longer aware they are using a propaganda technique at all. False flag operations. A false flag operation is an act of violence or provocation, staged or deliberately misattributed to create a justification for a response that has already been decided upon. The name comes from the naval practice of sailing under a false flag to deceive an enemy, and the political application follows the same logic. Create an incident that justifies what you wanted to do anyway. The Reichstag fire of 1933, which the Nazis used to justify emergency powers that effectively ended German democracy, remains the most studied example. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which the Johnson administration presented a disputed naval confrontation as a clear attack justifying escalation in Vietnam, resulted in congressional authorization for a war that killed 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. False flags work because they provide emotional permission for actions that logic and evidence would not support. By the time the truth emerges, the consequences are irreversible. Manufactured consensus. Manufactured consensus is the creation of the illusion that a position is more widely held than it actually is, making dissent feel socially dangerous by convincing dissenters that they are isolated when they are not. Authoritarian governments deploy organized crowds for staged demonstrations of popular support. Modern digital operations use bot networks to flood social media with coordinated messaging that makes fringe positions appear mainstream. The Soviet Union perfected the physical version, mandatory participation in political rallies, unanimous votes in staged legislatures, and the constant visual reinforcement that everyone agreed with everything. The psychological effect is powerful because humans are social animals who calibrate their expressed opinions against their perception of what others believe. If everyone around you appears to hold a position, the cost of publicly disagreeing feels enormous, even when private disagreement is widespread. Manufactured consensus does not change minds. It silences them. If you made it this far, drop a comment below and let us know which method surprised you the most. Subscribe so you never miss an upload. There's a lot more where this came from.